In today's video, I'll be designing and building a 1930s streamliner in Bloxburg. And in my quest for accurate Bloxburg engineering, I'll be interviewing an expert in the field of railways. My name's Commodore Turner, and this is how I built a streamliner in Bloxburg. Now, I'm mostly known for building ships in Bloxburg, and I've actually never done a train before, and I knew it wouldn't start super smoothly, so instead of diving straight in, I decided to create the station and platform first. The design of this station is based off the Cardiff Central Railway Station in Wales. One thing a lot of pro builders use for more gilded and ornate builds is this flower pillow, but I hadn't used it before, but I think it looked really great adorning the pillars of this station. Now unfortunately, Bloxburg doesn't have very many window options, so I did go with custom windows, which I made by connecting structurals to the window frame and adjusting it with the transform tool. I decided to take the massive windows from the Cardiff Central Station, which have two main parts, the main lower window and the upper window, which is above a fairly thick overhanging roof. I went a bit off script for the roof of the building, making it the iconic BSL port roof teal tiles that can be found on the roof of many Pier 59 docks, like that on the Pelagic, Pearlescent, Petrov, and even the Big Bertha. Then, I covered the building with more pillars, trimmings, bricks, and another awning. I decided to brand the station and train itself with the Ribbon Union Railway name and logo. This is accompanying the lore of my ships, and their locomotives have appeared in a few of my recent builds like the TSS Pelagic and the WTBZ-3 Battalia. Then I started on the track. I got a few comments on my Zeppelin video of people telling me some of the aspects of my J5500 steam train and the rail line itself was inaccurate, so I wanted to make sure I got everything super accurate in this build. I started by sinking the rails down into the ground a bit, and then making sure the sleepers were below the steel rails, unlike what I did in the Zeppelin video's railway line. Now that the station's completed, it's time to start working on the train. In my last video I said if I got me 100 new subscribers, I'd jump in the Murray River, and here we are, at the Murray River, because that video got me over 120 new subscribers. Alright, here we go. Alright, here we go. Thank you for 1.7 thousand subscribers. If you guys want to support me, join the Discord server or become a channel member. Oh, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Even though I mostly study steamships, I still had a pretty good idea on how to do the exterior and the interior. I started with the engine itself, beginning with its wheels and then framing the exterior before I added any details. The engine itself was mostly based off the New York Central Railway's Mercury Streamliner, which is a very interesting train. The train was originally a K5 Pacific class train before it was pretty much just wrapped in metal to make it look streamlined. The upside down bathtub, as it's known to the train community, was scrapped in 1953 in Ohio, while the rest of the Mercury itself continued to be in service until July of 1959. It's important to note that the Mercury refers to the carriages, not the actual locomotive itself. I ended up having an hour-long conversation with a steam train enthusiast on Discord for this information, but I may not have all the facts right, so let me know in the comments if I got anything wrong. Shaping the front of the train wasn't too difficult, and it was already looking pretty accurate, although I still had a lot of work to do. I decided to use a technique similar to the custom hulls I do for my ocean landers on the top of the train. By marking the structurals and filling it with shapes, I was able to make a pretty accurate streamlined curve. But I wanted to keep shaping the engine car right now, so I'll fill it in later down the line. People were already getting excited about this build, and it was looking like everyone really liked what I had so far. Even though I was really happy with the shaping so far, I ended up reshaping the front of the train to make it more accurate to the three-sided shape instead of the two-sided I already had, but this does mean I had to completely rebuild the front and the roof of the train. Then I started working on some smaller details like the light in the front and the handles on the side of the train for maintenance. Then I added in the smokestack, even if it's not really visible on a streamliner. The next step of building the locomotive itself is the cab, which is sort of like the train's bridge. It's where the engineer and driver would operate the train from, and it's sort of like the center of operations for any train, historic and modern. Although for now, I'll just do the exterior of the cab, because as I said earlier, I'll be interviewing an expert in railway history later in the video to ensure I get all of the engineering elements as accurate as possible. I then adjusted the roof of the cab to better match the angle of the rest of the locomotive's roof section, which I think looks much better than the straight roof I was doing beforehand. At this point, it was finally time to install the windows and finish off the shape of the inside of the cab, making sure to leave room for the boiler and subsequent equipment. Then I adjusted the front of the locomotive in an effort to make it more streamlined and also to simplify the design of this angled part to make it easier to copy to the other side, but I much prefer how it looks after this altercation, so it's a win-win. Now when I build things for my videos, I'm not recording 100% of the time, either because it's boring or I just forget, but regardless, the main cab was now completed and it was time to finish off the coal car. The coal car pretty much followed my ideas for the main carriages, just slightly smaller and without any windows. The carriage was pretty easy to make and it would just stay hollow for the most part, so it wasn't really anything exciting to build. After the coal car was completed, it was time to do the first of the 4 passenger cars, and I had plans to do something different for each car. Luxury streamliners like this are very different from the trains you're probably used to. Instead of looking like this, they look like this. In fact, the Mercury was one of the most luxurious streamliners in the world at its time of construction, and it was well beloved by its passengers. And it wasn't just seats, its flagship car was the parlor car with massive viewing windows. Now, I decided not to recreate the iconic parlor car windows as I didn't want to spend too much time on this build, but if you guys want me to see me build more trains in the future, I'll definitely incorporate something similar to the Mercury's parlor car. For my train, I decided to do a private cabin car, a dining car, a lounge car, and a seating car. This arrangement would have the train feeling accurate and nice without being anything too crazy that would take me literally months to make. If you do want to watch me go absolutely crazy on multiple month-long builds, I do have a video about both my Ocean Liner TSS Pelagic and my Zeppelin the WTB-Z3 Battalion, which might tickle your fancy. There's some pretty insane projects, but for now, we'll get back to the train. As you can see here, I want the train's walls to be white, and I'm using the snow texture for the walls just as a subtle detail. I don't want the train's interior to be too crowded with details. Instead, by using subtle textures like snow, I can add a bit of detail to what would otherwise be a blank wall, and it adds no clutter. Changing some walls from the plastic texture to the snow texture is definitely an easy way to spruce up a build a bit, especially for Art Deco, which uses shape more than ornate detailing. And train interiors are pretty limited in terms of shape, but I'll still do some cool shapes and angles in some other parts of the interior later down the line. And in the words of Jack Black from the second Minecraft movie trailer, I was starting to yearn for the mines, so I decided to start working for a little bit. By the next day, I had 3 of the 4 cars done in terms of exterior, and it was pretty repetitive to do because all the carriages are the same from the outside. The carriages were designed into 3 copyable sections. This is because if you have a bunch of shapes in Bloxburg all attached to each other, after a while you can't use the transform tool on them anymore. And because of the placement of the rest of the train, I needed to position them in with the transform tool. But it wasn't as easy as lining up the 3 parts, as I did it pretty messily and it was a bit finicky, but eventually I got it done. After I had done all 4 carriages, I made a pretty basic coupler and stuck it in between each carriage. If you don't know, couplers are what connects all the carriages together. Now, because I left too much room at the front of the plot, I sadly couldn't add big fancy vestibules, which are kind of like little rooms that connect the cars for passengers to safely walk through. So unfortunately, my train isn't the safest in that regard, but I did add some ropes in between the cars later on, so I guess it's kind of safe. But whatever, just grow up. After some more issues with the final carriage, my exterior was pretty much completed and it was finally time for me to start working on my interior, which I was definitely excited to do after seeing some really cool photos of real life streamliners, and I was feeling pretty inspired. My first job was to properly prep the interior. I added some new ceilings in and made sure all the interior walls were flush and there was no glitching areas. Then I started to plan out the train's layout with some walls, just so I could ensure everything would fit in fine, which I knew it would afterwards, which was definitely a relief. I really didn't want to have to rebuild the carriages, which was the thought in the back of my head while building, but I was sure everything was fine. By now, it was finally time to start working on the interior. One of the things I really wanted in the lounge car was some cool angled couches, but they were a real pain to build and ended up costing me around $20,000 each, and fitting the stools inside them was also not much fun, but it was definitely worth it in the end. I also made a cool bar in the lounge which had a nice curve to it and some cups on display. I even decided to add a little model of the Ribbon Union Railway trolley, which is in some already mentioned past builds of mine. I also decided to adorn the ceiling with a cool wooden center overhang with some ventilation, and I think it turned out super well, and it helped to add more texture to the room as I built it with twisted wood. The next car I needed to make was the seating car, which I decided to put at the very back. Now the pre-built seats are all sort of boring, so I decided to mess around with some custom seats for this car, and I based them off the seating cars and some other streamliners. Then I had to furnish the rest of the room by adding tables in between the chairs, adding flooring, and the ceiling details. I decided to split off this car a little bit and add a nice place for people to board the streamliner, as well as seats for the purser and conductor. I think the tables turned out really well, and I adorned each one with an Edwardian era lamp. Even if it's an Art Deco train, a lot of these trains still had references to the older days of travel by rails, and I decided to do this through the lamps, which I think works really well in the seating car, despite the Art Deco elements throughout the rest of the carriage and the train entirely. Then, I lined the walls with a slight wooden overhang to act as both an armrest and more ventilation, just to add a bit more colour and texture to the carriage, just like the lamps, and I think it translated perfectly. And after a bit more adjustment and a sort of secret dresser in the boarding area, all I was left to do was the decals, which I would do a bit later down the line. The third car I did was the dining car. Traditionally, a streamliner's dining car would have several small tables and seating, however I had visions for using this room to hold meetings and stuff, so I decided to make one big long table, and I think it looks really great here. I did end up remaking it to be slightly smaller so that passengers could pass it easily, and I also ended up removing the model of the trolley from the dining table and later replaced it with the Ribbon Union flag, which can be seen all throughout the train. Now, I did forget to record myself building the private seating car, so just pretend I'm building that here, because this totally isn't still footage of the dining car. And with that, the train's passenger interiors were completed, and all I had to do left was the engineering elements. But before I could build them, I needed to learn a little bit more about steam trains. I'm here with Richard Wood, a local expert in the history of railways.
Good to meet you, Logan.
What can you tell us about the history of this specific locomotive?
This specific locomotive did work on the Murrayland lines in South Australia. The RX class was a very common general purpose locomotive used by the South Australian Railways. It's definitely a broad gauge locomotive. It was 1600mm gauge. It's coal fired. This particular locomotive, I think, was built at the Islington workshops in 1913. The Melbourne Express used to be hauled by two of these in tandem, and sometimes a pushing locomotive was required behind. So by the early 1920s, these were not regarded as being powerful enough to do most of the heavy freight that was starting to develop. So W.A. Webb, who was the new commissioner who came out from America, introduced the 500, 600 and 700 class locomotives, which were certainly a lot more powerful than these.
So one of the main reasons I need to come here today is I'm a boat guy. I don't understand trains as much, so I kind of just want to point out little details for you to explain so I can recreate them better in Bloxburg. Okay, so walk me through how someone would go about controlling this.
Okay, well this cab has had large amount of its instrumentation removed. There would have been boiler pressure gauges, there would have been sight glasses to indicate how much water was in the boiler. But what we have here is what remains of the regulator. So that would basically control the amount of steam going to the cylinders at the front. There are some other controls here which would have controlled the Westinghouse air compressor, which is steam operated, but it would provide compressed air for the braking system on the train. This wheel here was probably the main control for the reverser, and on the other side the fireman would have had access to a handbrake. This cover here covers where the coal would have been shovelled into the firebox. These are all tube stay cups, all sorts of reinforcements within the boiler, and so these little caps here would cover up the stays, the end of the stays in the boiler.
So what can you tell us about the pistons and everything going on at this part of the locomotive?
Well, this is a two-cylinder locomotive, so this is the left-hand cylinder. Steam is emitted through valves in the centre part, so it's got Stevenson valve gear, and that drives through connecting rods to the drive wheel.
Now let's get to building this in-game. A big thank you to Richard Wood and the Historical Village for their time and letting me film. Now that the interview's over, I have a much better understanding of the engineering of the steam trains. Now, I did do a lot more further research because, as Richard said, a lot of the parts have been removed from the locomotive that we just saw, but regardless, I was ready to get started. I first wanted to make the boiler and firebox in an effort to properly lay out the space. It's the perfect place to start and ensure I have enough space on both sides of the cab for more equipment. I did end up lining the interior with a blacker colour just so the tech would pop better and just to add some contrast and difference from the exterior and interior. Once I had the proper shape of the boiler done, I needed to make the sight glasses, which helped determine the correct flow indication and spot any leaks of steam or vapour among other uses. Once I had the sight glasses in, I added the firebox doors, which I based off some Marshall & Sons Marine Engine firebox doors because I think they look really nice and I think it fit perfectly in for this locomotive. I used some landscaping lights for the boiler tube stay cups, which I think worked out perfectly. As fully black lights emit no actual light, they looked really nice and were easy and cheap to fit into the locomotive. After some finishing touches to the firebox door, I added some pipelines and other small things before moving on to the steam pressure gauges, which I placed at the top of the boiler, which obviously indicate the steam pressure inside the boiler. Then, I added some lights and moved on to the other sides of the cab. Similar to the RX class we looked at in real life, I'll be doing a wheel on each side for the engineer and the fireman. Then, I added some more controls, and these ones, like on the RX class, would operate the braking system's air compressor. I made it copyable and simply put an identical one on the opposite side, and all I needed to move were a couple of the smaller details. The last main detail I added was the radiator, looking very similar to the one of the RX class. Then, I added a few more small details to the cab before I called it done. My next job was to add a few more small details to the coal car, just so it wasn't completely blank and looked semi-accurate, and then I moved on to the pistons. I fully based them off the K5 Pacific Mercury Streamliners pistons, and I think they turned out really well. They were made with shapes so I could easily copy it over to the other side, ensuring they were identical. And with that, my new streamliner, the B700, was finally completed.